Thank you for being here for today's Todd Talk. We take teaching theory and turn it into teaching practice. We're going to be talking about how to close your speech, another in a series of videos on public speaking. So, why is it important to close your speech successfully? So, I want you to think about any story. Does the story go along and build up to its climax and then just stop? No. Typically, the way that it works is it follows this, which is your typical story. It has your introduction, it has your rising action, and then it has your falling action. And what this looks like is a clear beginning, a middle, and an end. And your speech has to have the same thing. You need a well developed introduction, which we talked about in another Talk. It has your middle, which is kind of the meat of your presentation, which is where you present all your evidence, all your information. And then you have to have your closing, where you then tie all this up in a nice, neat bow and then leave the audience with something to think about. So, how do you do that? What does that look like? And so that's what we're going to be talking about. So, here's the basic three parts to a closing. It's fairly simple. And so, part number one there is you're going to restate your through line. The through line is the most important part of your speech. So, of course, in your conclusion, you want to mention again. And you should have mentioned it in your introduction. You should have mentioned it several times through the main part of your speech. And then you want to remind that audience one more time, look, here's the through line. You may have heard it a few times. Just want to reiterate it again. Just want to make sure you have it. So you restate that through line. Leading into that through line, of course, you're going to have a transition from that last part of your body where you say, so in conclusion, or to wrap up, or to summarize what I'm saying. And then you get into that through line and you mention that through line as clearly as you can to make sure the audience is crystal clear on what it is that you've been talking with them about today. So after restating that through line, you are going to then summarize your main ideas. Now, what is the level of summarizing of that? So you don't want to include too much, you don't want to include too little. You want to do that Goldilocks. So what you don't want to do is you just don't want to say, I talked about three things today, and then just mention those three things in a one word response. You also don't want to re-give all the information you already just gave. So you want to try to summarize your main points in like a single sentence. So today I talked about one thing such as this, second thing such as this, and a third thing such as this. And then you would, have your single sentence that kind of summarizes the whole entire thing that you talked about without going into the details, without going into the stories. But it just reminds folks, look, this is what we talked about. It's always good to remind your audience, this is what you listened to today, just to remind them of what they heard, to trigger that memory. Then, once we get to this end, you want to really leave them with something to think about. And why is that the case? Well, because when you get to the end, this is the last thing the audience is going to hear. It's the final words that you have to say to them. It's the last impression that you have to make with your audience. And so what you want to do is you want to make a very strong impression. And the way you do that is that you have something that really leaves an impression on them. Now, let me give you an example of what it does not look like. I have heard speakers that give a closing that sounds something like this. And so I'm done. It's a terrible way to end a speech. Even TED Talks themselves, and I don't know if the TED Talk people train them to do this, but they finish all of their speeches with thank you. And that's the clue that the speech is done. You shouldn't need that clue that the speech is done. The speech should come to a natural end. You should, again, have that rising action, climax, falling action, and then a nice end to your speech. The audience should not be confused that you've come to an end. How you can tell the difference is if you watch a TED Talk, when the person finishes, before they even say thank you, the audience starts applauding because they realize from the natural progression of things that the speech has come to an end. There are other times where it's not so obvious. where they're not sure the speaker is done, and there's this awkward pause. You don't want that awkward pause. You want to make sure that your audience is clear that you've come to an end without saying, I've come to an end. So you want to finish with something that's going to allow them to know that you are coming to that end. So there are 5 things that you can do that can help have a ending with a bang, where you're finishing and people are like, oh, okay, got it. Because here's the thing about a conclusion. I often say you can have a great conclusion, but it's not going to save a bad speech. So if you had a poor introduction or a poor body that you didn't back up with evidence, or you didn't make a good case, a great conclusion is not going to save those things, because you don't have anything of a substance to save. However, if you have a great introduction and you introduced everything as you're supposed to, and you made it crystal clear, you get to your body and you lay out your argument and you show your evidence and you make a compelling case, and then you get to the end and you don't stick the landing, you have a lousy conclusion, it could ruin your speech. And so you don't want to ruin all that hard work that you've been doing. You don't want to leave the audience thinking, oh my goodness, that was terrible, because that's what they're going to be thinking if you have a terrible ending to your speech. Just like terrible endings to books and movies, that's all people think about, rather than the other hour and 45 minutes that they watched or the other 400 pages that they read. They just think about, it's a terrible ending. I mean, there are television shows that ran for 8 seasons and then they'll have a terrible series finale. That's all that people can talk about. Seinfeld being a good example. For those youngsters who don't know what Seinfeld is, it was a series that was on for many, many years, and yet the series finale people did not care for, and they still talk about how it kind of ruined the series. This one episode out of hundreds of episodes of great television, this one episode kind of ruined it. So you want to have that strong ending. So here are 5 things to consider. One of these is a call to action. And so a call to action is challenging your audience to do what you've been asking them to do. So, for example, if you've been up there and you've been talking about how you should be nicer to people, and that is your through line, then challenge your audience. So this is your chance to be nicer to people. This is your chance to do good in the world. So challenge the audience to do what it is that you've been asking, what you're trying to inspire, or trying to persuade, or trying to get other people to do in your speech. So that would be one example. A second example of an effective closing would be what's called a personal claim. A personal claim is then you yourself decide to take on what it is that you've been saying. So if you say, okay, so you need to get out and exercise more, and that's something that's really important. And so to show you how important this is, I am going to pledge myself to go out every single Sunday and go for a run at the park. And if you would like to join me, I will be at the park every Sunday at 10 o'clock. We'll meet at the picnic shelter. And if you'd like to go for a run, I'll be there every Sunday. That is my pledge to you. And so you're kind of putting yourself out there, but that has some power, because the audience will say, oh, not only is this person asking us to do it, but they're willing to do it themselves. A third one is called values and vision. And this is when you explain what it would look like if what you're asking of the speech were to come true. So if you're asking, for example, that all animals were adopted from the shelter, what would that look like? Well, it would look like that senior centers have puppies and that are keeping the elderly young and keeping them companions. It would look like people have pets in their homes that keep them happy. It would mean that there are no strays walking on the roads, or you would talk about what this vision would look like if what you're talking about came true. And so that's what the values and visions would look like. A fourth closing that you could talk about is what's called a satisfying encapsulation. What this looks like is at the beginning of your speech, you may lay kind of the groundwork for something that's going to come on later. So you talk about something, that seemingly it's related to what you're talking about, but it's never really explained, never really comes to fruition. But then at the very end, then you talk about that and you kind of tie that up, what you talked about at the beginning. And so what it might look like is if you say, okay, I'm going to talk about this statistic, and you lay the statistic, and then later in the conclusion, you have a follow-up statistic that kind of counters what it said, or that proves that what you're talking about worked. So that would be a satisfying encapsulation because you had something at the beginning, you had something at the end, and it kind of encapsulates the whole speech. The fifth one that you want to consider is the idea of a lyrical inspiration. This can be anything from a quote to a song lyric. It can be your own statement given in a very, inspiring manner. So this lyrical inspiration is just something that really sticks with people because it is given in a lyrical. I'm not saying you're singing it, but it's given in a way that is very poetic almost. So whereas you're saying, and so if you could do anything today, what you need to do is this. And so you're kind of giving it in a poetic or lyrical manner. And so that really sticks with people when you leave with something like that. And it clearly shows them when you have come to an end. So what I'd like to talk about then is what this might look like. So I'm going to give you a topic that I could have talked about in my speech. And I'm going to give you an example of all 5 of these, of what this might have sounded like. So let's say that my through line is that people should do community service. Community service has value. Community service does good for the community. That's my through line, something to that extent. So I could do all 5 of those, but I'm not going to do all 5 of them at the same. I'm going to pick one of them that I think would be most effective. But a topic like that, I could pick any of those 5 to do. So for example, a call to action. I could get in my speech and I could restate my through line. I could summarize my main points. So, here are 3 things you can do for your own community action. And then I could do a call to action. So you should go out and make sure that you're being involved in your community. You should, lend a hand. You should volunteer places. So I'm kind of putting that call to action out to my audience. So that's how I could do that one. When it comes to the pledge of my own, and so I could say, asking, here are 3 ways you could do this, and then I could say, and I pledge to do this myself. So I'm going to pick up all the trash around the school. And that's what I'm going to be doing on my weekends, is coming out to the school and picking up trash to make sure our community is as beautiful as it can be. And so you make this pledge, and then people are like, oh, wow, they're putting this pledge out there. A third way I could end the community service one is with the values and vision. I could say, imagine what it would be like if everyone in our town decided that community service was of value and they got out and did something for our community. What kind of community would we live in? It would be a community where we had beautiful gardens and no one went hungry because we gathered food, and there wasn't trash all over the place because people were picking that up. And so imagine what a beautiful city we would have if everyone paid attention and everyone took part in community service. If I were doing a satisfying encapsulation, I might start at the beginning of my speech with a story about a student of mine who, for one of their school projects, they started a canned food drive where they collected thousands and thousands of cans for a canned food drive as part of their project. That in itself is pretty cool, pretty compelling, a good story to tell. But what if at the end, and this is a true story, I encapsulate it by saying, and then remember the student I told you about at the beginning who collected all these canned foods? Well, they were so inspired by their own actions, by their own what they were able to accomplish, that they actually, the food shelter, Helping Hands, that was started by that student because they did that project, and what they did did so much good. They decided with their parents to open the Helping Hands food bank. And so the people can come over anytime and get food from the food bank. And it all started with that idea that they wanted to help their community. So this is a satisfying encapsulation because it takes the story from the beginning and then just continues it on at the end of the speech and even adds on to it. A fifth way you could do that is then a lyrical inspiration or a quote. So I could give a quote such as this right here, which is that I'm giving my through line, I give my summarization, and then I end with this quote. Without community service, we would not have a strong quality of life. It's important to the person as well as the recipient. It's the way in which we ourselves grow and develop. And you can see that comes to a logical end. People are not going to be confused if I finish my speech when I come to the end of that quote. They're going to be like, well, they're finished. And it's going to be very clear to them. So, in conclusion, it's really important that you have a strong closing. And there are many reasons why, but three of the most compelling reasons are that you really want to leave your audience with remembering what it is that you talked about. I mean, you talked about something at length, you want them to remember that. The second reason is that you want to remind them because they've been sitting there for so long, you need to remind them of what they've been listening to. Because, even 10 minutes is a long time to listen and they might forget. So in this conclusion, you are reminding them and they can say, oh yeah, that's what they were talking about. And the third reason is because you want to make sure you're telling the end of your story. You don't just want to stop the story. You want to have that falling action. You want to make sure that you bring that story to a proper end. And so I'll leave you with these words. The ending is probably the most important part of your speech. And so you want to make sure you give it the attention that it deserves.